Here's a question that sounds simple until you actually try to answer it. Why did it take humans so long to invent the sword? Humans were shaping sharp stone tools for well over 2 million years. We were smelting copper and casting bronze objects for well over 1,000 years before anything resembling a true sword shows up in the archaeological record. If humans could sharpen a blade and humans clearly wanted better weapons, why didn't someone just make the blade longer? The honest answer is that a specific, stubborn, genuinely difficult engineering problem stood in the way, and until that problem was solved, a long blade wasn't a better weapon. It was a weapon that would fail you at the worst possible moment. This is worth sitting with for a second, because it runs against how we usually imagine ancient innovation. We tend to picture progress as a matter of imagination, someone simply thinking of a better design. But the gap between the dagger and the sword wasn't a gap in imagination at all. Early smiths almost certainly imagined longer blades long before they could actually produce one that survived contact with an opponent. The real barrier was physical, buried inside the metal itself, and no amount of clever thinking could shortcut around it. To understand why, you first need to understand what came before the sword, because the sword didn't emerge from nowhere. It emerged as the solution to a problem that daggers, spears, and axes simply couldn't fix. Early close combat weapons were short for a reason. A stone or early metal dagger, typically somewhere under 30 centimeters, could be made thick enough at its base to survive the stress of stabbing, twisting, and blocking without snapping. A spear solved the reach problem differently, by putting distance between the fighter and a sharp point using a long wooden shaft, with the metal or stone tip only needing to survive a single directional thrust. Axes relied on weight and a swinging arc rather than a fine edge. Each of these weapons worked because its design sidestepped the central problem that a sword forces you to confront directly. How do you make a blade long enough to give you real reach in hand-to-hand combat, without that same length making it weak, whippy, or prone to snapping the moment it meets real resistance? This is where the actual difficulty lived, and it's a difficulty of materials, not imagination. Early metalworkers were using copper first, then bronze, an alloy of copper mixed with tin. Copper alone is soft. A copper blade holds an edge poorly and bends easily under lateral stress, the kind of stress you get the instant a blade meets another blade or armor at an angle rather than head-on. Bronze solved much of this, but only within limits. Get the tin ratio wrong, use too little tin and the metal stays too soft. Use too much, and the metal becomes brittle, prone to shattering rather than bending. Even with the ratio correct, usually somewhere around 10% tin to 90% copper, casting a long, thin blade introduced an entirely new set of problems that a short dagger simply never had to face. The length changes everything about how a blade behaves under force. A short blade under 30 centimeters distributes stress across a small enough area that a reasonably well-cast piece of bronze can survive normal combat use. Extend that same blade to 60 or 70 centimeters, and the physics turn against you. Leverage increases dramatically along the blade's length, meaning the same lateral force that a dagger shrugs off translates into a much larger bending moment at the base of a longer blade. Early cast bronze, even well-made bronze, tends to be somewhat porous at a microscopic level, and those tiny internal voids, invisible to the naked eye, become failure points precisely where the stress concentrates most severely, usually near the hilt. In practical terms, this meant early attempts at longer blades had a habit of bending permanently, or in the worst cases, snapping clean off mid-swing. In a hand-to-hand fight, a bent blade is nearly as dangerous to you as no blade at all. And a blade that snaps at the hilt leaves you holding a useless handle in front of an opponent who still has a weapon. This wasn't a small technical footnote. It was the central obstacle standing between the dagger and the sword, and solving it required advances on multiple fronts simultaneously. Not one clever trick, but a slow accumulation of metallurgical knowledge across centuries. Metalworkers needed a more reliable, more consistent casting process to reduce internal porosity. They needed to understand, even without the modern vocabulary of metallurgy, how blade cross-section affects rigidity, which is why early long swords often feature a raised midrib running down the center of the blade, a design solution that adds structural strength along the blade's length without adding excessive weight. essentially applying the same engineering principle you see in an I-beam centuries before anyone had a word for it. And they needed a hilt and tang construction, the part of the blade that extends into the handle, strong enough to survive being the exact point where all that bending force concentrated. The earliest genuine attempts at true long blades appear in the archaeological record around 1600 BCE, with sword-like weapons found in Aegean sites associated with Minoan and early Mycenaean culture on Crete and mainland Greece. These early swords, sometimes called type of swords by archaeologists, were long, elegant, and unfortunately still fundamentally flawed. Many surviving examples show a rounded, unsupported tang, meaning the section connecting blade to hilt was structurally weak precisely where it needed to be strongest. Combat use, or even vigorous training use, could snap these early swords at that exact junction. You can trace the archaeological evolution of the sword almost like watching engineers slowly identify and fix a recurring failure point across generations. Later Type B swords redesigned the tang with flanges, small extended flaps of metal that could be riveted more securely into the hilt, distributing stress across a wider area rather than concentrating it at one narrow point. This wasn't guesswork. This was iterative problem solving, generation after generation of bladesmiths encountering the same failure and gradually refining the design in response. It's worth pointing out how unglamorous this process actually was, because it complicates the romantic image most people carry of ancient weapon making. There was no single blacksmith who woke up one morning having solved the sword. What the archaeological record actually shows is failure after failure, preserved in the ground, snapped tangs and bent blades scattered across sites spanning generations. Each failure fed directly into the next attempt. A tang that snapped told the next smith exactly where to reinforce. A blade that bent under lateral stress told the next generation exactly how the cross-section needed to change. In a real sense, the sword was designed collectively, across centuries, by people who never met each other, communicating only through the physical evidence of what had gone wrong before. What makes this genuinely fascinating is realizing that the sword, unlike the spear or the axe, is not simply a longer version of something that came before it. It required crossing a threshold where blade length stopped being limited by available material strength and started being limited only by what a human arm could actually wield effectively. Reaching that threshold meant early Bronze Age societies had to develop a level of metallurgical sophistication, consistent alloying ratios, controlled casting temperatures, an understanding of structural reinforcement that simply did not exist when the first daggers were being made. In a very real sense, the sword is one of the earliest objects in human history that required what we would now recognize as engineering, not just craft, in order to exist at all. And once that threshold was crossed, the sword changed warfare in a way that went beyond simple reach. A soldier carrying a functional sword instead of a dagger suddenly had an advantage in the kind of chaotic, close-quarters combat where formation discipline breaks down and individual skill starts to matter. Unlike a spear, which is most effective when a fighter has room to thrust and space to maintain distance, a sword remains useful in tight, crowded combat where a long shaft becomes a liability. This versatility is likely a major reason swords eventually became associated not just with practical combat but with status and identity, carried by individuals whose role in a battle or in society set them apart. A sword wasn't simply a better weapon. It was a weapon that only skilled, well-resourced societies could reliably produce, which made owning one a signal in itself. Long before anyone thought to engrave a blade or wrap a hilt in decorative bronze wire purely for display. So the next time you see a sword in a museum case, gleaming under glass, take a second look past the obvious elegance of the shape. What you're actually looking at is the physical record of a problem that took metalworkers centuries to solve. A problem hidden entirely inside the metal itself, invisible unless you understand exactly what you're looking for. Every straight, unbent, unbroken blade in that case represents a solved engineering puzzle that earlier generations of smiths attempted and failed at, over and over, until someone finally got the alloy, the cross-section, and the tang design right at the same time. The sword didn't arrive because someone had a clever idea. It arrived because humans slowly, painfully, generation by generation, solved a problem that the material itself kept refusing to let them solve.